In 1888, in a prairie town west of Wichita, Kansas, 10-year-old Jimmy King, the son of a veterinarian, came down with symptoms of the dreaded typhoid fever. The previous year, Jimmy's mother had been healed of a serious illness by a neighbor who was a Christian Scientist. With Jimmy growing worse by the hour, the Kings sent for the same neighbor, William D. Hinchliff, to heal their son. W.D., as he was called by his friends, was a husky frontier farmer, strong as an ox. Strongest man in the county, neighbors called him. W.D. and his wife, Bertha, had found this healing religion barely 2 years earlier. According to their daughter, Cora, as soon as the Hinchliffs got the call for help, they left their farm and set out over the 5 miles of dirt road to town. At the King's home, W.D. prayed for the boy's recovery, just as he had in other cases recently, using what he had learned from the Christian Science textbook, Science and Health, with Key to the Scriptures. News about the typhoid case and the Christian Scientists raced around town. Outside the King's house, neighbors gathered in the night, troubled about what was going on inside. At one point, they took it upon themselves to call for a medical doctor. But when the doctor heard it was typhoid fever, he said the boy would die anyway, and he refused to come. Preachers in the area had been denouncing Christian Science, condemning it as the work of the devil. The group outside the home were of that mind. They believed the Christian Science cure being practiced by W.D. Hinchliff would send the boy's soul to hell. Some argued that the way to stop this Christian Scientist was to show him they meant to hang him. In the middle of the night, a group of them went to the hardware store and made the owner open up so they could purchase a rope. Back at the Kings, they waited in the dark, peering through the window, with the rope ready for a lynching if and when Jimmy died. Sometime during the night, Mrs. King stepped outside. The people outdoors demanded to know how her son was doing and what was being done to him. Mrs. King fended them off and shut the door. She never warned the Hinchliffs what was going on in the yard. Her greatest worry was that they would be frightened and stop praying. Perhaps she needn't have worried about that. These two new Christian Scientists were prairie pioneers and made of tougher stuff than would be easily scared off. The Hinchliffs worked through the night, and as the sun rose, the boy's fever broke. He dozed off into a normal sleep, and the household and the town calmed down. The couple wouldn't learn until days later the danger they'd been in. But there's no indication that they would have been deterred for a moment from their healing work, even had they known about the murderous hostility outside the window. To the contrary, W.D. and Bertha Hinchliff went right on spreading Christian Science through healing and regeneration in frontier towns of Kansas and Oklahoma. Where did such a man and woman come from?
They came from and were living links in a chain of healing, reaching back to one lone woman at work half a continent away in Boston, Massachusetts, Mary Baker Eddy.
In 1886, according to the reminiscence of his daughter Cora, William D. Hinchliff had found himself unexpectedly selling door-to-door in Des Moines, Iowa. W.D. was new at salesmanship, and he was not having much luck at it. Until that year, W.D. had been a farmer in southern Kansas. With the opening of public land, he had paid the U.S. government $1 an acre for a quarter section and plowed the unbroken prairie fields himself. Cora Hinchliff recalled that other farmers nicknamed her father the strong man of the county. He could work more and lift more than anyone around. One day he hefted a giant fork load of hay and suddenly doubled over in pain. Doctors in town and in Wichita diagnosed it as the worst case of rupture they had ever seen. There was nothing they could do for him, but they recommended a new type of truss. Hinchliff gave it a try, and it seemed to help some, but he could no longer work the farm. He leased his land to another farmer and in desperation went to work as a salesman for the company that manufactured the truss he was wearing. His sales territory was in Iowa. After many unsuccessful weeks getting prospects but few sales, he went back to Des Moines to look up 6 prospects and find out why they had not purchased his product. 3 of them said they had been healed by a Christian Scientist. W.D. was appalled. He had once studied for the ministry and had heard nothing but evil about this new religion. As a last resort, he went to see the woman the 3 men called a Christian Science healer. Her treatment included turning Hinchliff's thought from hatred of a fellow landowner who had wronged him. Over several weeks, he was entirely healed of the hatred and the rupture. Those weeks transformed his way of thinking. The family returned to their farm and W.D. went back to working his fields. Neighbors were amazed at his recovery, and he began to get calls about Christian Science healing. A neighboring farmer sent word he had been diagnosed with consumption and given 3 months to live. W.D. told him they would work it out somehow through prayer and study of the Bible and science and health. In 3 months, as the man himself put it, he was out plowing the sod instead of being under it. Later, that neighbor's daughter showed symptoms of black diphtheria. An epidemic was sweeping through the region. The neighbor called W.D., and after several hours of prayer and study, the girl began to recover. Then a few days later, her brother became ill with the same indications. Again, they called on Hinchliff. While he was at the neighbor's, his wife Bertha sent him an urgent message to come home right away. Their own daughter, Cora, had come down with the symptoms. W.D. waited until he was sure the neighbor's boy was all right. Then he returned home. By then, Bertha was frantic. Many years later, Cora recalled the scene.
She was afraid he would be too late to save me. My father just gave me one glance and said to her, "What's the matter with you? Don't you know she can't die?" My mother gave a horrible scream, I can remember it yet, and went into hysterics. She knew she had a dying daughter and an insane husband. When he had quieted her a little, he turned to me and gave me some truth. Before her eyes, she saw me begin to get better. From that moment on, she was a devoted Christian Scientist. Cora Hinchliff Lindsay.
A few days later, Cora's little brother George came down with the same symptoms. But with W.D.'s immediate treatment, the boy soon recovered. Cora recalled that out of the dozens of children in Sumner County who came down with the disease that year, only she, her brother, and the 2 neighbors were saved. Then there was Mrs. King, wife of a veterinarian who suffered recurring bouts of illness. She was furiously opposed to Christian Science, but when she was laid low by another attack, her husband brought W.D. to treat her. Mrs. King angrily turned her face to the wall and refused to speak to either of them. Mr. King urged W.D. to pray for his wife anyway. He did, and then went home. Mrs. King fell off to sleep without taking her nightly dose of medicine. She woke up the next morning, healed. The Kings promptly took to studying Christian Science, which explains why, a year or so later, when their son Jimmy came down with typhoid fever, they sent for W.D. and his wife to heal him in the face of violent community protest.
Within a few years, W.D. and Bertha were handling so many cases they couldn't keep up with their farm work. They had to make a choice. The farm was sold, and they moved to town. In 1891, they moved again to Wichita, where they joined with the fledgling church and enrolled in a class taught by its pastor, Willis Gross. who just a few years earlier had studied in one of the pioneering classes taught by Janet Coleman. Our story has come full circle.
The Hinchliffs worked with the Oklahoma legislature to protect the rights of Christian Scientists, and they and their children, Cora and George, continued their healing work well into the 20th century.